Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions will be about Ordinary Monsters by J.M. Miro. I'm going to jump right into the synopsis with this one. Ordinary Monsters is about children in the late 1800s, all of whom are born with talents, all of whom are orphans, and all of whom are living on the very edge of society, barely surviving, often living in fear that the people around them will discover their differences, because those differences make the people afraid, and the people's fear often leads to violence. There's Charlie, a black teenager in the southern part of the United States, whose ability to heal becomes a curse when he's convicted of killing a white man and he just keeps surviving his own execution. Then there's Kamako in Japan, who can manipulate dust, but cannot keep her baby sister safe. Then there's Marlowe, the shining boy, whose talent seems unlike any of the others, able to both hurt and heal, but whose short life has been marked with seeing him pass constantly from one guardian to another, often in tragedy. They are brought together at Carndale Institute in Scotland, a place that has been gathering talents like them for generations, to protect them, teach them how to use their talents, and maybe for something far more dangerous. And that's pretty close to the description that I read that made me buy this book. It sounds like a Victorian Harry Potter or X-Men with just enough Oliver Twist sprinkled in for flavor. And I mean, it sort of is, though it leans far more closely to the X-Men than Harry Potter, mainly because it shares a major theme with the X-Men, that people hate, fear, and will attack anything that is different from them, no matter how innocent. And I can't delay saying it any longer. I did not like this book. It's really not my cup of tea. Mainly because it's one hell of an angry book, especially the first half. As we are meeting the main characters, it was like the author needed to drag out every single trope of Victorian waifs being treated like disposable animals. We've got a street gang of kids run by violent criminals. We've got chimney sweeps dying and being thrown away in the trash. We've got maids murdering their bosses who have been sexually assaulting them. Or, on the other side of that, we're in America and seeing old racist white men talk about convicting a child to death while complaining about the fact his pie is getting cold. And I mean, yeah, a lot of it is realistic. To be honest, the late 1800s were a fucking terrible time to be anything except for a wealthy white man. But there's just so much. Not only does every minor character we meet act like an uncaring monster, but the POV characters are almost always thinking about how the people around them are cruel, unempathetic monsters. Or more to the point, how all people are cruel, unempathetic monsters. The segments that are in Japan actually feel a little less cruel, but then there's the point where a murderous mob tries to kill a small child, and yeah, not so great! And even when the kids get to the school and finally find themselves around people who don't hate them for being poor, not white, and magic, the book is written in a way that we are clearly intended to be constantly questioning who we can trust, if the kids are safe here at all, who is the monster. And it's just so not what I was looking for. This book is like the exact opposite of The Lost Dreamer, where there are a few evil characters in a soft, loving world. This book has a few kind characters, all of whom's kindness is couched in rather harsh exteriors, in a terrible world. And I have a bit of a problem with the basic premise that these talents would be seen as inherently evil by every single person who sees them. Like, yeah, I understand with Oscar, he's going to have troubles with his gift, but Kamako, her talent seems sweet, innocent, and harmless at first glance. And I do know that the history books show us that people often respond violently to the differences in other people, but I just don't think it's such a universal response like this author clearly does. I think there would be more people who would notice that it's harmless. Even the concept of what happens to you after you die is angry in this book. And yes, we do get to see the afterlife that exists in this world. And it's a depressing place with spirits slowly fading away while hungering desperately for life and warmth. So cool. Great. After these poor characters live through horrors of lives, that is what is waiting for them. And did I mention that the talents these kids have are described as being immensely painful to use? Because of course their lives aren't horrific enough without that. I also do have a little bit of a problem with the lore here. Like, the book does manage to present some interesting ideas, but I'm not sure they all go together. Like, Charlie heals himself automatically, but his Halen ability also allows him to basically pull a Mr. Fantastic and stretch his arms super long to reach things on the other side of the room. And like, Dr. Berghurst, the head of the Carndale Institute, talks about how all these abilities are based in death and manipulating dead flesh. But the Halen ability is clearly about life, not death. And then there's Marlowe's abilities that seem to have nothing to do with any of the other talents, and have nothing to do with the eventual explanation of his background. Also, the author works really hard to set up the idea that Dr. Berghast and some of the others at the Institute approaches these talents as clinically and scientifically as possible. They think that none of this is magic, it's all part of the natural world. But as things go on, it becomes more and more clearly magical, and most of these really obviously magic elements are introduced by Berghast, and there's like a nod to this near the end where he suddenly starts talking about like, oh, even though I'm chanting, I know that's probably superstition, and I could probably do this without the chanting, but obviously you can't, and there are several magic items, like clearly this is magic. And it just, I'm not entirely sure the lore always exists in the same world as the rest of the lore. But that wasn't the only thing that bothered me about this book. I feel there are also some continuity errors in this book. Some of them are the vague kind of continuity errors that I can wave off as just me and the author having different imaginings of what's going on. Like, things like how long the kids were at the school before shit starts happening there, relationships developing faster than I feel like they have a logical reason to do so, characters seeming to have no idea what's going on in one scene and in the very next scene knowing everything with no explanations in between. But there's one thing that really irritated me irrationally throughout the entire reading of this book. One of the adult characters is named Alice Quick. She's a detective who's hired by the Institute to find these kids and bring them back to Scotland. And when we're introduced to her, she's introduced as having been doing this job for a while. I got the impression of like a year or two. And like, she definitely has a developed relationship with her partner. Like, they seem to respect and know each other already. Which means that she's definitely collected a couple of these kids already. And yet she treats Charlie and Marlowe as the first kids she's ever collected for the Institute. She gets super attached to them. She actually at one point starts thinking about how I didn't realize this job was going to feel so much like kidnapping. And when we get to the Carndale Institute, she never comments on, and nobody else ever comments on, whether any of the other kids there would recognize her. And it's just like, is she new to the job? Or has she been doing this for a while? I don't know. But there's also downright direct continuity errors. One example is also featuring Alice. At one point, no spoilers here, but she's escaping some chaos with some kids. And it's 3 of them. We've discussed the 3 of them. We know who the 3 of them are. Except when they're riding away, there's a passage where it's mentioned that they ride away 3 to a horse. And I'm like, what? 4 divided by 3? What? And later on, it turns out, no, there were 15 of the kids there. And I went back and reread that segment to be like, did they pick up more kids along the way and I just didn't notice? And no, as far as I can tell, there's never any mention of them picking up other kids. I would bring up more of the continuity errors, but some of them I cannot bring up without blatant spoilers. And I don't want to ruin this book in case you're the kind of person who would enjoy this kind of complex, lyrical, dark fantasy. And I will also admit that some of these continuity errors might not be continuity errors. Some of them might have just been confusing-ass language. This is one of those books that often chooses poetic language over clarity. There were multiple moments that I was reading a sentence going, oh, well, that's lovely, but what is literally happening? There are moments that I was not sure if there actually was a physical dark shadow in the room or not, if people were meant to be dead, or if it was just a lyrical physical description describing them as looking like dead, if people were being healed or just feeling happy. And on the other side of that, there are other moments where we're just directly told things about characters that we never see. Kamako is described multiple times as being the sarcastic one, but most of the sarcastic comments come from ribs. There's one point that a character tells another, "You were like a brother to me," but we don't see that relationship developing in them. And everyone falls head over heels for Marlowe immediately. Like, they meet this 8-year-old and he smiles at them and they're like, "I would die for this child." And I feel like I'm missing something. I feel like I'm missing the moments where we see why people are so devoted to Marlowe. Eventually I started to wonder if his magic talent actually included the ability to just make people love him. Because the only people who are shown as not immediately devoted to this child are pure evil. And this confusion wasn't just line by line. So the first book I ever wrote, I only ever let one person read it, and her biggest criticism was that I held too much information back, wanting it to be a reveal later on. Reading this made me realize exactly how annoying that is. There are so many things that could have been described early on, explained early on, and yet it's hundreds of pages until the author deigns to tell us what the hell is going on. Hell, there's a good bit that is left for the sequel to explain, if the sequel even explains it. What exactly is the Druger? Where do talents come from? What happened to the first talent? What exactly was the Kiras? What was the glove and the ring? And why the hell did Dr. Berghash shave his head and beard before the climax? At this point, I don't even care enough to read the sequel. It feels like having that friend that posts cryptic shit on social media all the time, and whenever anyone asks them about it, they're like, "I'll tell you later." And then finally, after months, they post this like 2-page long monologue, and you just don't read it because you're just like, "I don't care anymore." But beyond all those criticisms, we have to get to the petty shit. Things like the glaringly obvious ignorance about corsets. At one point, Alice is having the fucking ubiquitous moment of bitching about having to wear a corset because that's the only shorthand anyone has ever used to describe a character showing feminist tendencies in the 1800s. But she reaches up and undoes a couple of stays while she walks. And no. Honey, just fucking no. Stays are a type of undergarment. They are not a part of a corset. Hell, for a lot of time periods, they are basically a synonym for corset. It's not something you can undo on your corset. So what I'm assuming he meant was that she reached up and unhooked a couple of the hooks on the busk, which is this part, but you'll notice that that's really hard to do with full access to the corset. And that is with this corset relatively loose because this corset doesn't really fit me anymore. But just no. Like, I'm sorry, no. Notice that I can barely get one undone with like full access to the corset without having to unlace everything behind me, which by the way will be under a couple of layers of probably pretty tight fitting clothing. So no, and even if I did manage to get a couple of the hooks, oh god, unhooked, this does not relieve pressure. This only moves the pressure further up the corset so that it's digging in more up here and right here, which is the part where it is actually the tightest. So no, the entire description of the scene left my mind in tatters because that is not how corsets work. My problem here is I understand not everyone has ever worn a corset and therefore knows how they basically work. But if you do not know anything about how women's clothing works, do not write about women's clothing. And objectively, none of that would have bothered me if I didn't find the shorthand of corset equals female oppression incredibly overused and frankly a false metaphor to begin with. Victorian clothing is pretty restrictive, especially for upper-class Victorian women, but it's not because of the corset. If you are wearing a corset that actually fits you properly, then, it does not restrict your breathing, it's not painful, you have full access of movement. Hell, if I wanted to, I could get up and touch my toes as easily as I can normally, which is not that easy. But the important thing is women exercised in corsets. Women did full days manual labors in corset because, yes, lower class women wore corsets too. So the entire notion that corsets are the problem was never correct. Generally speaking, the actually restrictive part of Victorian women's clothing, besides the bustles and the excessively large skirts, was often the sleeves. They had very tight sleeves with almost no movement. Upper class Victorian women often could not lift their arms higher than basically this. So that is what is restrictive. Yet I have never seen a book, a movie, anything show a woman complaining about the fact that she can't lift her arms above her head. Instead, they just have her complaining about, oh, corsets are so painful. So painful. Oh my god, I can't wear one. And I'm sorry. It's just cliche and wrong. And it's a narrative that was invented by men because they thought women were being silly. So I just am a bit tired of it. But letting go of that anger, moving that aside, letting go of the petty shit, because objectively, one badly written scene about corsets will not ruin my enjoyment of a book. I want to end on the good here. This book does paint an incredibly evocative world. The language is often quite beautiful, and there are some new ideas in here. It interweaves a lot of different plot threads and plays with timelines in a way that is effective and quite interesting. There are a couple of really interesting action scenes. A few of the characters are really likable. Ultimately, I just didn't like how dark of a world this was. I tried my best to like it, but I had to force my way through this book like I was walking through thigh-deep water. It just wasn't for me. And yeah, I just did the end of the entire thing in a corset, because why the fuck not, bitch? Bonus footage. Look! Very little restrictions!